Hey, welcome to another episode of our biblical story series. We're going to be talking about Thanksgiving and God's guidance and providence of our nation. And this is going out on Thanksgiving Day. So happy Thanksgiving, to everybody. And I hope it's a blessed time for you. So having said that, I'll turn it over to Brendan.
Yeah, you mentioned in your article that it was the providence of God that helped to establish America as a nation. Now, do you really think it was God's providence, his intervention, that helped us become a nation?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I base that upon what our founders and our key leaders have believed about our nation, especially since the founding. Even before the founding, you look at the original Thanksgiving with William Bradford and the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower. And, they were not escaping, the story goes is that they were escaping persecution from Europe. They were not. They were living very peacefully and successfully in Holland. But they believed they were called to a mission to start a new form of how the kingdom of God would spread. And so they came over to America. They weren't very good sailors. They were originally going to Virginia, right, and they ended up going 250 miles north, accidentally landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts. But when they landed there, it was providential. They saw it as the hand of God, which had led them there, because they went to an area where there had been an Indian village filled with all kinds of resources. It was the ideal land. It was a place where they could establish a new form of living out God's kingdom. They developed the Mayflower Compact, which has become the basis of how we organize our government around a constitution, a common people doing this, not an elite monarchy or a system of government. It was there that they encountered, Squanto, a lone Indian who was a Christian, who understood how to develop corn and agriculture, and he showed them how to fish and everything. And it was through them knowing him that they were able to live, in Massachusetts and establish, a way of living there. And they saw all this as the miraculous hand of God. After a very difficult winter, they had an incredible harvest. They joined together with, other Indians. And they lived in harmony with the Native American people for 50 years. And so they did not come for economic gain. They did not come to exploit the land, but rather they came because of a calling of God. And so they saw the intervention of God repeatedly, and the first Thanksgiving was established around that. For 250 years following, up until the founding of our nation, the Declaration of Independence, our forefathers had saw the hand of God repeatedly. George Washington saw God continually at work in his life, even in his 20s. Those who were preachers, those who knew him, even there was an Indian tribe that saw that he was destined to be a leader of our nation and to bring our nation into its founding. And Washington, had so many providential acts of God in his life. And when the Continental Army, after they had, began, in 1775 to, fight against the British Army, they had saw God delivering them time and time again. And so this went all the way up until our Washington in 1789 proclaimed, a national Thanksgiving. And then Lincoln later on, who saw the hand of God, we'll talk more about him, involved, he nationalized and made it a regular holiday. So over and over and over, founders, leaders, common people had just sensed the miraculous power of God at work in our nation. And so because of that, we give thanks. That is our reason. We are a great nation because of God's hand and providence. And so because of our greatness, a lot of people feel guilt. And because they feel guilt, they think we must have done something wrong. We stole, we were thieves, we exploited, and there were some sins involved. but we have become a great nation because God's favor was upon us. And the original Thanksgiving celebrated that. And so it was a tradition that continued to be carried out, up until today.
And to give a call back to a blog a few weeks ago, this just goes to show that there's no reason why God can't be at work in America today if he's been at work throughout the hundreds of years of our history.
Correct, yeah. I mean, and, when Lincoln, we'll talk about him, but when he established this as a regular holiday, on the last Thursday of November, it was probably at the very darkest, bleakest time in our nation's history, but he sensed that God still had a plan for this nation. And so, he called upon the nation to seek God, to pray, to return thanks, but to trust his hand of providence to guide us. And so for this Thanksgiving as well, we should be in the same frame of mind.
Yeah. So we brought up Lincoln a few times, so let's stay with him. You mentioned in the article that it wasn't until Lincoln arrived and saw the carnage of Gettysburg that he became a Christian. Now, why do you think that was?
The fascinating thing about Abraham Lincoln is people don't realize that he was such nearly an atheist and a strong skeptic of especially Christianity, but really any particular belief of God in general. He was a very thorough-going skeptic, near atheist. Even up until when he started, his run in politics, he could be respectful of religion for political reasons. But it would be a pastor who his family came in contact with in Springfield, Illinois, who was an atheist who became a Christian, and he wrote what would be called a lot of apologetic writings defending the faith. And this became presented to Abraham Lincoln, the evidences for the resurrection, the prophecies, the accuracy of Scripture. And when Lincoln was confronted with all of this, he said, this is unanswerable. And so it began to kind of open him up to the gospel. And the thing about Lincoln is him becoming a president was so, it's almost like something out of Forrest Gump. He was from the backwoods with no education. He was a prairie lawyer. Had he not become the president, we wouldn't know of him in history. Of all the people that were vying to become president, Solomon Chase and so many others, these were powerful, notable, highly influential men, and that Abraham Lincoln had ousted them in vying for the presidency in 1860 is just unbelievable. But he had the temperament, he had the call, and he sensed that as he was about to lead the nation through our Civil War, that the hand of God was leading him. And the more we progressed through the Civil War, the more he came to see God's hand, the more he was dependent upon God, the more he depended on prayer. And Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War, at least for the North. That was the point where we really turned, or at least the Yankees or the North turned a corner. And I think it was there with just the devastation, the sense of his need for God, the sense of his dependence upon God, that was then in the midst of seeing the sacrifice of the 60,000 who had died, that he turned his life more over to Christ. And when he saw us going through the Civil War, there has been no president who has understood the destiny of our nation in the sense of God's providence and God's calling in America's unique place in the world than Abraham Lincoln. But understood this came from a very thorough place of skepticism that he had from his youth and as a young man. So it's a remarkable story.
It is. It's powerful. Let's talk about the Thanksgiving Day Proclamation. What can Christians take away from that and implement or apply into their own life?
Well, Thanksgiving, as it's been practiced for 450 years, was to do two things. It was to look to God and to know that He has provided for us, return thanks. But just as much about looking towards the past, it's about looking toward the future. The very God who has blessed us in the past is the same God who will lead us into the future. So Thanksgiving has often been about prayer. Sometimes it's not been about feasting, but been about fasting. Mm-hmm. And so I think in this time of Thanksgiving, when we look at the divisions of our nations, the problems that we're facing, the sense of hopelessness, we should be looking to God and saying, God, you have preserved, you have blessed this nation. We are still the most powerful nation upon the earth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, even in comparison to China, our gross domestic product is 50% more than the Chinese, though we have a significantly less population. You know, we are still at a place where God can significantly use our nation, where Christians can still be involved in making disciples, mobilizing missions, and multiplying churches. And this is not a time to throw up our hands in the air and say, oh, we're just doomed, to go down into, failure. Now is a time to say, God, you have been at work in our nation. Allow us as your church, allow us as your people to be involved in what you want to continue to do, because the job of advancing the kingdom is not over, and America still has a vital place.
Right. We cannot be complacent. Right. The job is far from done. How does Thanksgiving humble us?
Well, I think it humbles us in the sense, and it kind of goes back to, is that we need to have a sense of gratitude, that our greatness as a nation, our greatness as a people, is something that God has bestowed and gifted to us. And if we forget that and we become arrogant, we become prideful, we become greedy in whatever way, form, or fashion, we will not properly steward the blessings and the gifts that God has given to us. In the secular world, more and more today, because of our blessings, there's guilt. And out of the guilt, people are having condemnation. They're saying we're a horrible nation. We couldn't have gotten what we have unless we had hurt or we had enslaved or whatever. And those things were there. But we're not great because we did those things. Many nations have practiced those for centuries, and it never led to greatness. The greatness has been despite those things, that God has given us grace so that we can continue to learn to overcome our failures, our mistakes. And so I think it's a time and a call for prayer, it's a time for humility, and it's a time for hopefulness.
Well, Anthony, thank you for writing that article. I read it, and there's a lot of that Thanksgiving background that I just didn't know, and I imagine that a lot of people who read it will find the same thing. On a closing note, if you put on a hat, you might look a little bit like Abraham Lincoln.
I'll take that as a compliment.
All right. See you next time. Thank you for joining Anthony and I today on the Biblical Story video series. Please subscribe to the Crossroads CCO YouTube channel, like, and share this video. Until next time.